Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are really grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. Now, John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who's contributed. We really, really appreciate it. Now, on this episode of the show, we're going to be covering something that's quite topical at the moment. The economic war, or the Anglo-Irish trade war of the 1930s. Now, why is this relevant at the moment, John?
Well, listeners will be aware, I imagine, of the international context by which the American president has embarked on a trade war, more or less with the whole world at the same time. So currently the state of play is that the tariffs are in abeyance, the really high tariffs on Europe, but we have a tariff of 10% on all countries, I think, which were announced in his announcement last March, I think it was. So the idea in this case being to reduce the American fiscal deficit actually by raising tariffs on imported goods and to try to encourage, I think, manufacturing in the United States. How well it's being thought out is open for debate, Cathal, I suppose.
Yes, it'd be interesting to see how it pans out. We were to go into the future 12 months from now and see what happened. But it seems a lot of this stuff is more of a threat or a negotiating ploy than an actual firm blueprint for moving forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that within the American Republican Party, there appears to be factions who are very wedded to this idea. But in the case of the president, I think he's more addicted to quick headlines and to making a big splash. The point is, we are back in a world where people are using tariffs and trade as sort of weapons of economic warfare, which is what we're going to be talking about today in the context of Ireland in the 1930s.
Well, very much so, very much so. So we should start in with the 1932 election, to put it into context, which sort of kicks off this whole issue of a trade war or an economic war between Ireland and Britain. Now, what happens in 1932 with the election?
I think, first of all, Kyle, I'd like to go back a little bit further. So,
yeah.
The Irish Free State came into existence in 1922. And of course, it came into existence in a very contested way. There was a civil war between adherents and opponents of the treaty. Now, as a result, you have a pro-treaty government from 1922 to 1932, led by the Cumann and Nail Party, which is originally a descendant of pro-treaty Sinn Féin. And they're committed to implementing the treaty. They have different parts. They have parts that are very Republican and were ex-IRA people, and Sean McKeown, and Owen O'Duffy, not a member of course, but very closely aligned. He's the Garda Commissioner. On the other hand, you have people who were former Redmondites, who disliked the militant nationalist tradition. And you have some former Unionists as well, particularly in Dublin and border areas and so on. But above all, though, the policy is conciliation with Britain, advancing Irish aims in that context. So they would argue that the Statute of Westminster in 1930, they secure kind of legislative, or they and Canada and other dominions secure legislative independence and stuff. But conciliation with Britain and very, very conservative economic policies. So the policies in the 1920s are repair the damage of the Civil War, balance the budget, because the state very nearly went out of business during the Civil War, which was actually what the anti-treatyites were trying to achieve, but nearly went bankrupt during the Civil War. Balance the budget, encourage the strong parts of the economy. So this is the kind of very conservative economic orthodoxy of the day. So don't get in the way of the hand of the market, but encourage the parts of the economy, which in Irish case is just agriculture. So you've lost the industrial part with partition. And encourage, free trade for the agricultural sector. They do some intervention. I mean, they do a Land Act, which is often forgotten about in 1923. They do quite a lot of buying out of land, which also has to be subsidised by the British. But in general, in economic terms, they cut social welfare. They cut the pension, for example, to balance the budget, very famously.
Yeah.
And they don't do an awful lot in the way of trying to develop an economic base. Not much in a way, strangely enough, to further the economic thought of Arthur Griffith, who's the founder of Sinn Féin and, of course, a pro-treatyite himself, whose whole idea of Irish independence was based around economic self-sufficiency. So, conciliation with Britain, balancing the books, and free trade, basically, is what you have before that. Now, on the other side of the political divide in Ireland, to simplify, because you also have the Labour Party and others, but to simplify, you have the anti-treatyites, who by 1926 are regrouped into Fianna Fáil. And in a strange way, I think it's fair to say, on the economic side, they're the true inheritors of Griffith's Sinn Féin. They're interested in economic self-sufficiency, also land redistribution, creation of an economic base, an industrial economic base rather, and more provision of social services in the way of social housing and unemployment assistance and things like that. So this is all tied up with the treaty dispute. I mean, they portray this and it's viewed as a way of breaking dependence on Britain as well, not being a vassal of Britain and so on, is how they would put it. Whereas the other side, the Cumann and Nail side, who, as I said, have various tendencies, they saw and portrayed the emerging Fianna Fáil as a stalking horse for the IRA. And it is true at this state that a lot of IRA people and Fianna Fáil people are the same people, still at this state. But potentially also communism. Now, there's a big red scare. There's a couple of red scares in the 1920s
well, it's
and 30s.
interesting the way they say that De Valera is either Lenin or he's Kerensky. He's going to be wiped away and the real communists are going to come after him.
You better explain the Kerensky reference.
February Revolution, you have Kerensky. After the October Revolution, he's knocked aside and you have the Bolsheviks. But the idea that, anyway, with De Valera, you're one step closer to communism.
Yeah, and also there's this very specifically Irish context. So the famous Cumann and Nail posters, one of them says, we want no red in our flag, which is the Red Scare. But the other one says the shadow of the gunman. So you have anarchy in the gunmen of 1922 and so on. Mm-hmm. So the gunmen of 1921 actually are all right, but the gunmen of 1922, all bad. But this is peculiarly Irish arguments. But there is this thing of De Valera is perceived as a radical or perceived as a stalking horse for the true radicals.
Yeah, and that he's always going to come under pressure from the more radical elements within the IRA if he's not going fast enough. They'll disavow him and find somebody who will. Yeah,
and just on the IRA, so the IRA also has different tendencies in it, and as people who are purely Republican or nationalist, purely focused on the national issue, you have left-leaning people, and the most famous one is Peadar O'Donnell. And one of the things that they're doing, and this will come on to our discussion in the 1920s, is trying to get farmers to boycott the land annuities. So the land annuities are one of the payments the Free State owes to Britain under the treaty. And actually, there are a lot. Like, they're forgiven a certain amount in 1926 in return for disregarding the Boundary Commission and any claims on the North, basically. But there's still a lot, and the land annuities is the biggest one. Like, they also have to pay the pension of the RIC, which is actually a fair whack.
Yeah.
The land annuities is the biggest one. It's £100 million, which is an enormous amount, in the 1930s.
So basically, to cover the period from the early 1880s until 1909 or so, all those different land acts where the government would advance the money to tenant farmers to buy their own plots of land. But
the thing is, the early land acts are all about security of tenure, so it's really just the Land Act of the early 1900s ones, the Wyndham Act, and the explanation of that. So the 1908 one is the big one. So basically, the payments since 1908, mostly from 1901, and effectively and mainly 1908, to the British government had, just like you said, paid up front to landlords so that the tenant farmers could buy out their plot, and the tenant farmers had to repay them in a series of instalments. But it is actually a huge amount of money. So the Irish state is supposed to collect the land annuities, and then they're supposed to pay to the British government £100 million. Now, the antagonists of the treaty who said that this was a larger per capita debt than Germany had incurred in the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
Whether it was or not, I don't know, but I mean, it is a very large amount of money. And of course, now I'm getting on to Peadar O'Donnell here. One of the things Peadar O'Donnell is doing, as well as talking about a workers' republic and all, which is kind of abstract, is getting farmers not to pay the land annuity.
Yeah.
And so a lot of farmers are actually already boycotting the land annuity. by 1932.
In the 1932 election, Fianna Fáil run, one of the planks of their platform is that they're going to cease paying the land annuities.
Right. This is one of the things, and they frame it as not only, an economic thing or a fiscal thing even, but like striking out for Irish independence and striking off the shackles of the treaty and so on. So coming to eventually swinging around to your question, Kyle, 1932. So 1932 election. There's also, this show is about the economic war, but there's also a context of the repeated use of coercion by the Cumann na nGaedheal governments. Like there's several public order acts, like there's the famous Public Safety Act in the Civil War, and there's another one in 1923, but it's invoked irregularly afterwards, like in 1927 after Kevin O'Higgins was assassinated by the IRA, and I think there's another one in the early 1930s as well, if I'm not mistaken, where people can be interned without trial and so on, and there's a lot of cases of people being beaten in custody and stuff like that. So, Liam de Rosta, who was a pro-treatyite, said of his party, the problem is that they have an iron hand with their own supporters and they have a velvet glove with the British.
Yeah.
This is the perception. So, anyway, for all of these reasons, they also have the impact of the Great Depression as well, which I suppose we'll get onto in a little bit, the international context. But Fianna Fáil, for the first time, won an election. Like, we had a show before, Cathal, where you spoke about Cumann na nGaedheal nearly left power in 1927, but didn't.
Yes.
But this time they do. So, with the help of the Labour Party, who don't actually get any ministries.
No, it's a minority Fianna Fáil government supported by the Labour Party.
Yeah, and so the Fianna Fáil Party, which is the ancestor of the so-called irregulars from 1922-23, enters government, essentially on the programme of they're going to rip up the treaty.
Yeah. And quite explicit in their election manifesto that all the issues that were most objectionable before the Civil War regarding the treaty, that they're going to remove through legislation, things like the oath to the British Crown, the role of Governor General, all these different things, all these different
Land Annuities.
Yes. So while you would imagine that the economic war is purely about, the economic relationship between Ireland and Britain, the context to all of this is the constitutional relationship between the Irish Free State and the UK.
Absolutely. And at this point, I think we should talk about the British reaction to the 1932 election. The British perception of the treaty was not that they were defeated, but that they got a good, reasonable settlement in Ireland, and they put reasonable people in power who were happy Dominion and who would be good allies. And they were happy enough that Cumann na nGaedheal would be that, albeit Cumann na nGaedheal is still a bit too independent-minded for them, but they perceived them as being reasonably responsible, and Cosgrave as a man they could do business with. Now, De Valera, I think maybe even have been the British that coined the term the Irish Kerensky for De Valera. So they saw De Valera as a dangerous radical who was, going to rip up the treaty settlement, and who was the man who caused the Civil War in 1922, and a man who could not do business with.
Because you have to remember, at this time in the House of Commons, you still have Lloyd George and Winston Churchill in there, people who'd been centrally involved on the British side with regards to the Anglo-Irish Treaty.
Yes.
But they're not at the centre of British politics now. Churchill has resigned over matters to do with India, and Lloyd George is quite an old man now, and he's outside.
He's actually writing his memoirs most of the time at this point, yeah. But it was actually kind of interesting to talk about the makeup of the British government. Like, strangely enough, there's a Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald.
Yeah.
Albeit in a coalition that's dominated by the Conservatives and Stanley Baldwin. So it's an interesting one. And I'm leaning here a bit on a paper that you sent me recently, Cathal, by, I think, Deirdre McMahon. The spectre of Churchill as the right-wing Tory hangs over Baldwin. So Baldwin can't be seen to be weak on Ireland because Churchill is hanging over his shoulder. And he's still in the House of Commons as well. So this is the British government you're dealing with. It's a coalition government, yes, led by the Labour Party, generally more sympathetic to Ireland, but really dominated by Conservatives.
Yes, it was actually split, the Labour Party, when Ramsay MacDonald goes into this national government. So they're National Labour. Yeah. And there's another anti-coalition Labour in the opposition. But it's funny reading all the reports about the British government at the time. They are convinced that De Valera will not last long.
Absolutely. And, you see this echoes of this in modern politics all the time, particularly with international affairs. Oh, this one is doomed. They can't succeed. The thing that we don't like can't happen because we don't want it to happen.
Yeah.
And you see this from all sides, frankly. But in the case of De Valera, the British are convinced that the moderate majority of Irishmen, as they put it, are good pro-treatyites, happy to be a Dominion. happy in the Commonwealth, and for some reason, some aberration, they managed to elect De Valera, but that won't last.
No, a couple of months of De Valera, maybe a year, and the Irish people will return to their senses and put Cosgrave back in power.
Right, and so this sets the scene for what happens in the economic war, because it is really a political dispute conducted with economic weapons, I would say. So De Valera does what he said in his election programme. Strangely enough, it was his first time in government, so he hadn't learned all the tricks yet, I suppose. Too cynical, Cathal? I don't know. Anyway, no, De Valera withheld the land annuity. He said to Britain he was not going to pay the land annuities anymore. And the British retaliated with tariffs on Irish agricultural goods. And of course, at the time, the Irish economy is mostly agricultural, and about 90% of the exports go to Britain.
Yeah, I think it might have even been slightly higher. Like a huge amount of Irish exports go straight to the British market.
Yeah, live cattle, famously.
Live cattle. But also things like butter, eggs, pork. And we had Conor McCabe on a much earlier episode talking about the Southern Irish economy since 1922. So these were all live cattle exports. So instead of processing the meat, having tanneries and leather works around Ireland, they're exporting live cattle.
Yeah,
and then
cattle on the hoof.
Cattle on the hoof.
They'd be driven down the North Wall in Dublin over to the boat to Liverpool and Holyhead.
And then all these other ancillary industries are happening in Britain.
In Britain, right. Well, I guess we'll come back to that aspect of things, but in any case, so the British put, I think, first of all, 20% tariff on Irish agricultural goods, and they expected De Valera to either fold or to collapse, his government to collapse, and neither happened though, and I think that they just really misjudged the temperament of De Valera, but also of the Irish electorate. So what actually happened was De Valera retaliated on British goods, so initially manufactured goods, but then expanding it to coal. And at the time, Ireland was quite a big market for British coal, particularly from Wales.
Yeah, see, this part of the thing people think as well is that, like, the Irish economy is completely dependent on Britain. All our exports, well, vast majority of them go to Britain. But people don't remember that a lot of the British economy is dependent on Ireland as a trading partner too.
Yeah.
We're one of their biggest trading partners.
And this is echoes, of course, the Brexit thing of a few years ago.
Yeah.
Because the British actually do a lot of business selling to Ireland. Did then and still do today.
Yeah, we're a major importer of British coal.
Yeah. So De Valera has cards, as somebody would say these days, but despite the fact people think he doesn't. So he slaps tariffs on British goods, and so then you have a trade war, and the British retaliate again, and it escalates. So I think the figure is by 1936, when there's some sort of agreement implemented, like it's agreed in 35 actually, but it comes into play 1936. But there's an average of 45% tax or something on all goods between Britain and Ireland. Like it's really quite enormous. Relations between Britain and Ireland are the purview of a guy called Thomas, who is the Secretary of State for the Dominions. And Thomas is very much of the view that a few short, sharp sanctions, tariffs, a bit of a tariff war, and De Valera will collapse. And Cosgrave, who is responsible and who we can do business with, will be back. And the rhetoric in the British government is De Valera is a lunatic, he's a fanatic, he doesn't know what he's doing, he'll collapse in a few months. And I think, there are very strong echoes of this in many fields these days, that, the thing that you want will happen just because you do a few demonstrations. And of course, it's not the case. Like, whatever one thinks of De Valera, he is a disciplined party, he's a very strong grassroots organisation, and he's determined. He's not going to fold. And so, the other thing about this is, I suppose we'll talk at more length later about this, is this actually, it makes De Valera look strong, he's standing up to the British, he's not folding, which plays very well with the kind of middle ground, I think, in nationalist Ireland. But B, it dovetails with Fianna Fáil's economic agenda.
Yes.
Which is actually a form of economic nationalism. So they want to build up Irish industries, and it helps if you don't have competition from
It's
imports from Britain.
Don't let a good crisis go to waste.
A good strategy, yeah.
Yeah, so you can start building up that manufacturing base, the Griffithite idea, building up a manufacturing sector in the south of Ireland behind a tariff wall. Yeah,
and the British seem to miss this, or they underestimate it, I think.
Yeah. Now, I must say as well that Cosgrave and Cumann na nGaedheal don't come out of this period, this early days of the economic war, very well. Like, they're going over to London and telling the British government, stand firm, don't make any concessions to De Valera, as this will only strengthen them, and then we can come back. So it is a case of, like, siding with the British against the Irish government in the hope that this will break De Valera and bring them back into power.
Yeah, albeit not in public,
Of course, not in public.
But yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm gonna play devil's advocate though and talk about the pro Treaty 8 point of view here. So like, I mean, for them, these are the wreckers of 1922. They wrecked the country. They caused the Civil War. They killed Michael Collins. They killed Kevin O'Higgins. They're totally irresponsible. They're not to be trusted. Look, they're just they're showboating for the crowd, for the masses, and they're doing all these populist things, and they're going to collapse the good, responsible country. And something we'll get onto further in the show, there's also a kind of a class aspect to this, because the bedrock support for Cumann and Nail comes from the farming class, and what this means is the people who are cattle exporters mostly.
Yeah,
at
the
time.
big farmers.
The big farmers. At the time, a farmer means a big farmer.
Yeah,
that's like, I heard an anecdote, just to digress here, Cathal. I mean, I was at a history kind of discussion once, and a guy was telling an anecdote from Tipperary, and the doctor said the doctor in the local village in County Tipperary somewhere was woken up at night time, and he would stick his head out the window and he'd say, "Are you farmers?" And the implication is, if you're farmers, it means you've got enough money to pay, and if not, I'm not bothering with you. Yeah. So a farmer at the time means the rural middle class. Now, and if you look at the pro-treaty election results in 22, 23 and 27 and so on, the other elections, this is where they get the big vote. They're damaged, of course, immediately by the economic war, because it puts a big cost on their exports to Britain.
And they're really the main victims of the economic war in Ireland.
Absolutely. We'll park that though. Let's come back to that. But De Valera's base, on the other hand, are typically the poor farmers, right? And strange as it might sound, because people have this idea of De Valera's Ireland and maidens dancing at the crossroads and stuff, and urban areas. Yeah. So one of the striking differences between, say, the 1922 election and the 1932 election is that Fianna Fáil, and the 33 election much more so even, Fianna Fáil has won the urban areas, which is a big change, because that's not the case at the time of the Civil War. So the point is, though, that the economic war hurts Cumann and Nail's base and not Fianna Fáil's base.
Yeah.
Whether you want to view that cynically or as a result of wider forces and so on, but that is the case, though. So the thing is, though, is that the British have a demonstration quite soon that their policy is having the opposite effect from what they want, because there's another election in 1933 where this time Fianna Fáil wins an overall majority, so they don't need the Labour Party anymore. So it becomes clear to the British at a reasonably early stage that it's not working, the economic coercion they're attempting to use.
And they continue to win election after election.
Yeah. I mean, they go
through the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah. I mean, again, I want to park that a little bit and come back to it, but to say at this point, they actually dip a bit in 37, but then they have a very good election in 38 when they settle the economic war.
Yeah.
So the thing is, even the British realised by about 1934, it ain't working.
Yeah.
It's not having the results that they wanted, which, remember, are political results, not economic results.
And this is the thing as well, when you look at the British response in the early days, there seems to be almost a belief that most Irish people like the oath. Most Irish people like the provisions of the treaty, rather than reluctantly accepting them. And even among Cumann and Nail, even among Cosgrave, they would prefer to see these things gone through, mutually agreed negotiations, which isn't going to happen at that stage.
I mean, yeah, there's first of all,
they seem to believe that people are wedded to these ideas
in
Ireland.
I know, but I think there's reasons for this, though. I mean, I agree with you that the British throughout the early 20th century in Ireland and beyond totally misunderstand Irish nationalist culture. They failed to come to grips with it. Like, one of them, I think maybe Asquith, the Prime Minister, famously says about the 1916 Rising, "I cannot understand the psychology of it." And there's a lot of that going on. But the second reason, I think, is the Irish people who they talk to are Irish people who are working in Britain, who have done well in the establishment, who do hold those views, who are proud to be members of the Commonwealth and the British Empire, and people who've been soldiers and so on. So I think that the Irish people who they know would be very much of that bent. Yeah. And they're not, it's not that there are no people like that in Ireland, but it's a minority view. Yes. I'd say at the most probably 10 to 20%, I would say. The former Redmondite vote, maybe.
That sort of influences a lot of the thinking, as we said. So one of the things that happens with the annuities issue is that it's proposed that this would be dealt with by arbitration. But there's two very different views from the Irish side, the British side, how this arbitration will come about. Because from the British point of view, they want this arbitrated within the Commonwealth. The people sitting on the arbitration board will be all members of the Commonwealth, whereas Ireland rejects this completely. They want it to be international arbitration, maybe gone to The Hague or somewhere like this. They don't want it dealt with through the Commonwealth channels. And one of the reasons why they don't is because the Boundary Commission, as we remember from a previous episode, the chairman of the Boundary Commission is South African, and this is all done through the Commonwealth, obviously. And it's another issue, Fianna Fáil pointing to another issue, where Cumann and Ale are viewed as weak in dealing with the British. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to be weak.
Yeah, I mean, and just to back up that about the Commonwealth, I mean, Jan Smuts, who was the Prime Minister of South Africa, who, funnily enough, had once upon a time fought the British for the Boer republics, but who became a very kind of convinced imperialist afterwards in terms of the British Empire as a force for good in the world, which is a strange progression. Now, you had an intervention in Irish affairs in 1921 and helped to broker the truce, actually, of that year, but during the economic war, he's actually writing to the British government saying, you must not give in to this lunatic De Valera who was trying to destabilise the empire and all right-thinking people. And no doubt Smuts is thinking of Afrikaner nationalists in his own country. He probably views himself as the South African Cosgrave, if you like, and De Valera as, you know, the Afrikaner Bund or whatever the extremist Afrikaner nationalist party was in those days. I think also to talk about the economic international context, before we zoom in again to how it settled, is the Great Depression. So the thing is, yes, Ireland turns to protectionism during the economic war, but as somebody remarked, Ireland was one of the last free trading countries in the world, you know, by 1932 anyway.
We're really out of step with everybody else.
Because what had happened was, it was actually the United States that started the ball rolling as a result of the Great Depression, so the banking collapse of 1929, which had, of course, you know, domino effect in that this collapse of capital, therefore the collapse of investment in industry, demand goes down, causes the Great Recession of that time, the Great Depression. The Americans in 1930, to try to alleviate the results of the Great Depression, put up tariff walls for their industry to try to stimulate their own industry. But this had a knock-on effect, and global trade had declined, I think, around a third, between a quarter and a third, you know, a massive decline between 1930 and 1932.
You also have the issue of reparations being paid back from the First World War.
Yeah.
And also from the British point of view, war loans owed to the United States.
Right. But from the point of view of protectionism, though, the point I'm making here is, yes, this is what happens between Britain and Ireland, but like, it would have been inevitable anyway that the Irish state would have needed tariffs to protect itself, given that everyone else is doing the same thing. So free trade is fine as long as everyone is a free trader. You cannot do it in an environment like the 1930s where everybody is trying to protect their own industry. Now, whether that's the right policy or not, economists can argue about. That's beyond my expertise. But it is true, though, that in the context of the 1930s, the Irish Free State's not that unusual at all. And studies by, for example, Kevin O'Rourke and Cormac O'Grada have compared, say, Ireland, Canada and Denmark in the context of the 1930s. What do they have in common? They're all at the time predominantly agricultural countries who predominantly export to Britain. Ireland does about the same as Denmark. Canada does a little bit better because it's a member of the Commonwealth and they're not having this dispute. But O'Grada's point is maybe it didn't make that much difference, you know, given the international context.
Yes, very much so. And like, if you look at what's happening in Britain at the time, they've about 2.5 million unemployed in 1932. It goes up to 3. And the Depression is having a major impact on the British economy. Yeah.
Now, I think it's time to talk about the internal stuff in Ireland. But before, you know, we get into the resistance to De Valera's policies and the Blueshirts, which is an important topic. De Valera's policies, which are to put up these tariff walls, create Irish industries behind the tariff walls, mostly for the internal market, and also to set up a whole lot of semi-states. And also to kind of try to nationalise the economy, like not in the socialist sense, but to nationalise in the nationalist sense. There's a law passed where every company needs a majority of Irish members on its board. Something that would be quite unthinkable today in our current climate in Ireland. But these policies of economic nationalism have some results. So this was very unfashionable for many decades to say in Ireland. But again, according to O'Grada's figures, there's about a 10% increase in industrial employment in Ireland in those years. So again, what are you doing? Like, yes, you're hurting the agricultural sector, but you're helping the urban sector, which is becoming a Fianna Fáil base at the time. But there's a reason why people would have voted for Fianna Fáil more in 38, say, than in 32. And the reason is because for a large proportion of the population, the results have been quite good.
Yeah, and if you couple that with the slum clearances, social housing, these are all things that Fianna Fáil embraces in a big way.
Ruth McManus, the housing historian, will say the Cumann and Ale actually had planned big housing policies anyway, so I'll park that. But certainly the perception is that it was De Valera that did it. So in terms of increased employment and welfare, in the context of the Great Depression, there's something to be said for this. Like it's became the kind of anathema, it's the opposite of what we were all about in Ireland in recent decades. But in the context of the 30s, the results are reasonable.
And the other thing as well is it was very smart politics. Like he put so much of the pain associated with the economic war purely on the shoulders of the big farmers and the big ranchers, is that for the urban working class, a lot of this beef that can't be sold to the British market is given away free to the urban poor.
That's right. Now, I guess that's kind of cynical, but there you have it. That's politics. I mean, the other thing about it, the downside of it is, the protectionism thing is, the industries that grow up are really just for the domestic market. They're not making anything that's all that good that you can export anywhere else. And there's a limit to the domestic market, particularly with the massive emigration you have out of Ireland at the time. Like the population isn't growing.
Yeah.
So it increases industrial activity and increases employment to a certain degree, and it can't go an awful lot beyond that. Is the big problem?
No, because we don't have any diversification of exports. We're still roughly exporting the same makeup of like live cattle and agricultural. We're not setting up shoe factories and then those shoes are being sold all over Europe.
No,
that's not the way it's working.
No, and we don't start doing that until basically foreign companies get invited in to do this in the 50s and 60s. And this is the problem, that De Valera's policy, or the economic nationalist policy, hits a wall in the 1950s and can't go any further. So there's a logjam and eventually has to be broken. But in the 1930s, my point is, it does have some results, particularly for the supporters of Fianna Fáil.
Yes, the other thing we should say as well is that there are various types of assistance payments for small farmers and rural labourers.
Yes.
But the plan being as well is that Irish agriculture will turn more to tillage than cattle grazing, because it's labour intensive. You create a lot of new agricultural jobs. It also means that at the time Ireland is importing a lot of wheat and cereals and flour, and we should be able to produce these ourselves at home. Yeah,
and to be fair, again, in the emergency in the Second World War, the country does manage to feed itself. It's not necessarily easy, but they did. So there's, even though the tillage policy is not all that successful, actually. Like, for example, I've talked to people who are historians of agriculture in Ireland, and they talk about how there was grandiose plans to clear the bogs and Connemara and stuff, and they found it wasn't possible. I mean, the soil is too acidic, and so on. And so all they're really good for is, sheep and cattle, pasture agriculture. And also the other thing as well is the Land Commission, which is set up under the De Valera government, which is a political initiative really to redistribute land. So from big farmers to small farmers.
Yes, but I think, as Conor McCabe wrote in his book, Since the Father, the type of farms that they're creating are still too small to be economically viable.
Yeah.
Like, I think from his figures, you needed 35, 40 acres. And some of these are coming in at 25,
yeah, and
30
depends on the
acres.
quality of the land, no doubt, as well.
Yes, that's also a factor too.
But it's really a political thing, though. Like a lot of the things De Valera did, to be fair.
Yeah. Well, he always had his eye on the political impacts of any decision that was made.
Yeah, but I mean, to place this in the context, though, of the Ireland of the 1920s and 30s, I mean, one aspect of the Civil War, particularly the tail end of the Civil War, was that there had been a lot of farmers at the end of the Civil War who were not paying rents. They decided they didn't want to pay rents anymore. They hadn't been paying their debts to shopkeepers, agricultural workers on strike. And the army was sent in, a part of the army called the Special Infantry Corps by the pro-treaty government to take back the land where it was occupied, to put down strikes, and to make sure debts were collected, and to put people in jail for things like cattle driving and all, seizing people's cattle and so on. So it was perceived very much as a government of the big farmers, the Cumann and Ale government. And so De Valera's politics make sense in that light. So the Civil War is not about that, and I don't argue that. What I'm saying is that aspect of the Civil War of imposing state power in a certain way in 1923 is something that Fianna Fáil capitalises on. Their constituency grows among those people.
Yes, and we can see in 22 and 23 that anti-treaty Sinn Féin, their largest support is along the western seaboard, the areas with the worst land, highest emigration, lowest employment, all these type of things. They do very, very well there.
So, okay, to return to the 1930s though, and we're going to switch tack. So we've been arguing almost from De Valera's point of view, I suppose, but to switch tack, one of the things that De Valera does though is, yes, he withholds the land annuities from the British, but he also keeps collecting them in Ireland. Now, if you're a cattle farmer, there's all this cattle that you can't sell. A lot of it has to be slaughtered at below cost. And this is the result of this guy De Valera, who's wrecking your economy as far as you're concerned. And he still wants to collect the damn annuities. So there are a lot of people in Ireland.
And rates as well.
Yeah. And a lot of people in Ireland at the time, in rural Ireland, who view De Valera as just a wrecker. You know, he's wrecking the economy for political gain.
Yeah. And, you know, having some payback on his political enemies. And the biggest support of his political enemies are large farmers and graziers.
Yeah, this doesn't go without comment, of course.
Yeah.
Now, this ties into the wider kind of political infighting or strife that there is at the time. Because as we said, Cumann and Nail view De Valera as basically kind of illegitimate. You know, he's borderline a terrorist in their eyes. And he legalises the IRA, of course, and lets out their prisoners in 32. And you have things like the IRA kind of stewarding Fianna Fáil rallies at the time for a fairly brief time, as it turns out. But
and the other thing as well is that when De Valera gets elected, president of the Executive Council, wasn't known as Taoiseach then, when he would go to a town, I think there's a couple of instances of that, he'd stop and take the salute from the local IRA rather than the Gardaí or the army.
Yeah. So there's a transitional period, let's say. Yes. But I mean, within that period, people view him as a wrecker of the economy, terrorist sympathiser, maybe a communist, who knows? Which the communist thing looks hilarious in retrospect, but at the time...
But sincerely believed.
Yeah. So you have the growth of the Blueshirts. Now, I think the last show we did was with Padraig O'Rourke, who talked about the far right in Ireland. There's the political aspect, of course, of the Blueshirts, naturally under Owen O'Duffy. So they start off as the Army Comrades, stewarding meetings and stuff, and they morph into a thing called the National Guard or the Blueshirts. And they have the fascist-style uniform and the fascist-style salute. But one of the major elements of the Blueshirts, though, is about the economic war. So a very large proportion of Blueshirts in rural areas are there because they are farmers who are unhappy with De Valera wrecking the economy as they see it. And I would say this is the major part of the Blueshirt thing, particularly in its kind of its second half.
Yeah, it's like the Civil War has moved on to an economic plane now.
Yeah, and as we said, the thing is, I think that's underappreciated is that there is some continuity there between the Special Infantry Corps of 23 and the Blueshirts of 1932.
This is what I found interesting when I was reading up for this podcast, is that the British are describing the Blueshirts as a white army, like in reference to the Russian Civil War. And they're talking about, like, you know, the Blueshirts, they come from a much better class of people than the IRA. Obviously talked about the class connections there. But as you were talking about the Special Infantry Corps, during the Irish Civil War, you do have these labour disputes in places like Waterford and South Leinster, where the people opposing the rural labourers describe themselves as a white army.
Correct, yeah. And very strong correlation with the Blueshirt areas of the 1930s. So, yes, some of it is about straightforward, you know, the Civil War antagonisms. Some of it has to do with right and left, a certain amount, as the Blueshirts are very anti-communist, even if the IRA aren't really communists at all. But a lot of it has to do with this rural class conflict. And so, whereas De Valera is perceived to be helping the poor people, he's hurting, what do they call them? The respectable men of the country. That's the way they would have described themselves. He's an irresponsible wrecker who is just wrecking the people who have made something of themselves, you know?
Yes.
And he's helping, like, the beggars. And this is the way people talked about it. And I have to include a personal anecdote here. So my mother's family would have been very strong pro-treatyites at the time. So first of all, they were Redmondites and then Fine Gael. And they were known to describe De Valera as the thief, you know, in the 1930s. That digression aside. So one of the things the Blueshirts are involved in is the Fianna Fáil government has actually recruits a lot of former IRA men into the Gardaí. So some of them recruited into a thing called Broy's Harriers, which is like an irregular part of the Gardaí. Pardon the pun.
Yes.
But some of them just directly into the Gardaí, and they're seizing cattle from farmers who won't pay the annuities to the De Valera government. And so there's a big riot in Cork City. The cattle are impounded in a place called Marsh's Yard, which, for those of you who know Cork City, is now mostly a car park town. in the middle of the island, at the middle of Cork City. They're impounded there, and the Blueshirts come and they try to ram the compound with the truck, and one of them is shot and killed by an armed Gardaí. Yeah, one of the Blueshirts martyrs. I mean, I think there's 3 or 4 Blueshirts killed in the various riots and stuff that took place, but one of them, the only one killed by the Gardaí, was killed trying to break out these impounded cattle. So it's directly connected with the economic war. For me, this is the heart of the Blueshirt thing. It's one of the reasons I take issue with some of the things in Padraig's book. I think the economic thing is at the heart of the Blueshirts, and once it fades away, as we'll discuss, the Blueshirts largely do as well. Like, there's other aspects to that, like what Duffy is very inept leader, the new Fine Gael, because Cumann na nGael becomes Fine Gael with the merger of the Blueshirts and the National Centre Party. But Fine Gael actually quite uncomfortable with the extremists in the Blueshirts. But I think the main thing behind the Blueshirts, the main driving force behind their foot soldiers, if you like, is the economic war and the hardship it causes to the well-off farmers.
It's a very powerful recruiting ploy that you can say to the sons of well-to-do farmers and people like that De Valera's policies are really hurting you economically, and if we get rid of him and change tack and revert to the way things were, you'll have a noticeable upturn in your family's fortunes.
And of course, this is precisely what the British policy was intended to do. So it's not coincidental, this is the intended result. But of course, it doesn't work, because, as we said, Fianna Fáil won an overall majority in 33, and by 1934, actually, you have a new Dominion secretary, a guy by the name of Malcolm MacDonald, and he's a much more conciliatory line. He says there's no point in trying to push De Valera further, because further he won't go. It's actually helping him politically. And it's also hurting not so much the British economy as a whole, but certain sections of it. Like, it's hurting the Welsh coal producers who export a whole load of coal to Ireland.
Well, this is the thing. As we've mentioned before, the British government is a coalition government of different parts, and one of the parts are the National Liberals. Like National Labour, this is the part of the Liberal Party that broke away to form parts of the government. Now, with the Liberals, one of the strongest beliefs, one of their core ideologies is free trade. So they're not really convinced on this idea of a trade war and sending tariffs back and forth across the Irish Sea. So they're not very keen on this either.
Yeah, and so basically the British government in 1934 decides that they're going to have a settlement with De Valera. Now, it's not a final settlement yet. The first thing is, it's called the Cattle and Coal Pact. So basically, the British agree to... first of all, the British had also placed a quota on cattle, so, as well as tariffs. Reduce the quota, so let more Irish cattle in and reduce the tariffs. And in return, De Valera is going to lower the tariff on coal. And so that patches up the most harmful parts of the economic war.
And one of the things
it's still going on, actually.
But yeah, one of the things we should say as well is that one of the alternatives to using coal in Ireland, that famous phrase, burn everything English apart from their coal.
Yeah.
That wasn't coined during the economic war, it was used quite a bit, but it comes from
Jonathan Swift, yeah, right.
Is that you get a big increase in turf as and this really comes into its own during the Second World War.
Yeah, Bord na Móna, one of the semi-states
the
Fianna Fáil government sets up. We should mention also Sean Lemass. It was the kind of, at this point in his life, the ideologue of semi-state industry and protected industry and so on.
And he's the man behind the Control of Manufacture Act that
you
mentioned earlier. But I think the British realise, and you have realists like, as you mentioned there, Malcolm MacDonald, that the oath is gone, that issue is gone. Mm-hmm. It's not coming back. And the other things that De Valera is pushing forward on in terms of dismantling the treaty, the Governor-General, the issue of the Governor-General. Now, it's not abolished straight away. They eventually get...
they devalue it first.
They devalue it and get the...
They stick their own man, Donald Bulkula, in, and he doesn't even live in the official residence. He still lives at home and so on.
It just becomes a complete cipher. It has no value. And getting rid of the right to appeal to the British Privy Council, that's gone too. Also, one of the things, getting rid of the Senate when it starts to hold up issues like the oath.
Yeah, I mean, we maybe should have another show about this. I ended up writing a chapter of an academic book about the Irish Senate once, but the Senate, under the treaty, can hold up bills for 18 months and De Valera ends up just abolishing it. Now, they hold up that for 18 months, but then it's gone.
Yes, but one of the things about the composition of the Senate is it's not a directly elected body. The public don't vote for it. So the idea being, when it's set up first, is that it will be representative of minority views that wouldn't have a large voice in the Dáil if you're purely going based on population. So there's a lot of conservative, old unionist voices within the Senate, and they're very reluctant to engage with De Valera's policies of dismantling the treaty.
Yeah, but De Valera just gets rid of them with the stroke of a pen, which the thing is, and someone asked me about this once in Amsterdam at a conference, and I wasn't sure because it seems so mad, but under the treaty, the Parliament can abolish parts of the Constitution. This is the 1922 Constitution now, which seems mad, but there you go. The idea was if things didn't work, they could just get rid of them. Now, they never envisaged what would actually happen, that the majority party in the Dáil would just scratch out whole parts of the treaty, which the Fianna Fáil government was doing. Now, another part of the context, I think, though, is that the security context. Like, first of all, De Valera banned the Blueshirts. Like, there's a number of bills, and actually this is what the Senate went down over, by the way, the refusal to pass the bill banning the Blueshirts, or banning the wearing of uniform, actually, is what it says. But bans the Blueshirts, basically defeats the Blueshirts, really. But also then doesn't ban the IRA actually explicitly till 1936, but starts to try them in front of military tribunals, so which is effectively a form of internment in 1934. So by 1934, De Valera has a handle on the security situation as well. It's apparent there will be neither revolution nor counter-revolution. Let's put it that way.
Yes, one of the things we should talk about as well, like, is the whole international context, the Commonwealth context. Because we've done an episode before about the abdication crisis, and we've talked about that, and there's articles on the Irish Story about that. That this really presents Ireland with an opportunity to loosen the bonds between Ireland and the Commonwealth, or Ireland with the Crown, probably more accurately. But it's really the fruition of things like the Statute of Westminster of 1931, is that while the British can say De Valera is acting arbitrarily and he can't decide any of these things regarding the relationship between Ireland and Britain and regarding the treaty and the Irish Constitution on his own, it all has to be negotiated and agreed with. Under the Statute of Westminster, he kind of can.
He kind of can. And one of the interesting things is, like, Winston Churchill again, who was at this time in opposition, but who was thundering away I nearly said the Dáil, in the House of Commons. He's saying there's no right to do this, because he's obviously one of the architects of the treaty. The Irish Free State only exists as a dominion of the British Empire. And the problem is, and this keeps coming back to Churchill actually in his dealings with Ireland, his later dealings, is the lawyers say yes, they can actually, because of the Statute of Westminster, where the dominions are all legislatively independent. The other thing is Churchill and others are talking about how they can't abrogate, the land annuities, because that's an article of the treaty. But somebody pipes up and says, but what about the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1926, by which the Irish debts to the British Empire are forgiven in return for waiving the Boundary Commission? And this is not certain. They're not certain about this one way or the other. But
this is very interesting as well, when you see the way the documents that the memos they're sending and letters to each other, is that they're outraged initially that the Irish government are talking about not paying the annuities, and they're saying there's a moral obligation on the Irish to pay this, and they have a duty to pay it. And when there's talk of arbitration, they start to get a bit worried about what an international arbitration would entail. And De Valera might be right. He might have a proper legal case not to pay them. As you said there, the 1926 agreement following the Boundary Commission, saying that Ireland, or the Irish Free State, didn't have to pay any more contributions towards the British public debt. And one of the things that De Valera does when this kicks off is not only does he say that Ireland shouldn't have to pay any more annuities to Britain, he asked for the 30 million that's already been paid to be returned to Ireland. And
no, that's politics,
Another 400 million to be paid to the Irish people based on overtaxation in the 19th century. So there's something about De Valera and his negotiations. We probably would have been far better off if we would have had him dealing with different bodies after the 2008 crash.
Well, indeed, but I was just thinking, if De Valera did that today, be all on Twitter going, look at this lunatic, has no idea what he's doing. He'll crash after 6 months, and politics doesn't always work like that. Now, the thing is, though, we should move towards the final settlement, because 34 or 35, the Coal and Steel Pact, is not the final settlement. It's an amelioration of the economic war. So the final settlement is almost...
Sorry, John, there should be one quick thing that we put in there.
Yeah.
Is that in 1937, you have Bunreacht na hÉireann and the new Irish Constitution, which sort of puts to bed a lot of these issues. Once it's passed.
Yeah, so De Valera passes a new constitution. There's no mention of the Crown. He's already deleted mention of the Crown in 1936. But there's the stuff about, the oath of allegiance and all is put to bed by the new constitution. There's no going back, and the British realised that. But the 34-35 Coal and Steel Pact is an amelioration of the economic war, not a settlement. The settlement comes in 38, and it shows you that the economic war is really about political issues, because it's almost entirely about the political relationship between Britain and Ireland. So by this point, and this is post-Munich and everything, the British realised that they have a serious problem with Nazi Germany, that they will have to fight a war with them sooner or later. Now, of course, Neville Chamberlain, who's the Prime Minister, is very famous for the Munich Agreement and peace in our time. The truth is, they don't believe that. They know it's only buying time, actually, to rearm.
And he was one of the big hawks in 1932 and 1933 in terms of dealing with the Irish.
Is that right?
Yeah. So he, by that stage, I think he does see the realpolitik, as you were saying there, of the Irish situation.
Yeah, so the Ireland is one of these things where you have to make sure it's not going to be a base for a hostile power, because a European war is coming. So what happens in the end is tariffs are reduced to a low level on both sides. You might have more precise figures than me on that, Cathal, but the big thing from the Irish point of view is the British agreed to return the 3 treaty ports. So the 3 Atlantic ports that they'd kept under the treaty in 1921 at Cove, Bearhaven and Lough Swilly. And they're handed back to the Irish government. And very importantly, they abrogate the article of the Treaty of 1921, which says that in time of war, Irish state has to hand over all its other ports. So that had been an article of the treaty. I mean, one of the things people argued about back then as to why not to accept the treaty. But that's gone as a result of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1938. So it's a major concession on the British part. Now, as regards the thing that started the whole dispute, the bill of the Land Annuities was 100 million, and De Valera managed to bargain them down to 10 million, which is a pretty good result, actually.
With a once-off payment.
A lump sum of £10 million.
Yes, so without the return of the treaty ports, it's very difficult to see how the 26 counties could have been neutral during the Second World War.
No, they couldn't. I mean, because again, treaty says in time of war, not only the 3 treaty ports, but also hand over all the other ports. And had the British insisted on it, maybe they wouldn't, but they could well have done. Then there's no way you could be neutral.
No, but it would have been a constant source of instability within the state during the Second World War, because you would have had the IRA attacking these installations, the British having sent over extra forces to...
Yeah, there would have been necessitated a British garrison.
Yeah.
A very substantial British garrison all along the coast.
Just to protect them, yes.
Yeah, and God knows what else, internal conflict, possibly German intervention, who knows. Certainly German bombing anyway. But I guess that's the topic for another show. Now, on the economic side, one of the things is the economic war is a massive victory for De Valera. Whatever damage it did to the Irish economy, and it really hurt part of the Irish economy, but like Cormac O'Grada and others argue, in fact, probably for the majority, the policies of that era were beneficial, which is something that would have been heresy for many decades to say.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, you can see it in the election results. Fianna Fáil's grip on that urban working class vote really grows up through the 1930s, into the 1930s, into the 1940s.
And poor rural vote as well.
Yeah, and more so that the rural labourers, the small farmers, they're wedded now to Fianna Fáil.
And they're not dummies. There's reason for this, though, is what I'm going to get at. And one of the things is, actually the Fianna Fáil vote dipped a little bit. By today's standards, it's still enormous in 1937. And actually, I didn't know this. I read this morning, that very briefly there, the Labour Party enters again with Fianna Fáil in 1937 in a minority government. And following the end of the economic war, the agreement with Chamberlain, Fianna Fáil called another election in 38, and this time their vote is up to over 50%.
Yes, and
which is unthinkable, of course, in modern Irish electoral
absolutely.
terms.
And that is in multi-seat proportional representation. It's very difficult to imagine any party getting over 50% of the first preference vote. But from that election in 1932, for the next 80 years, Fianna Fáil are the largest party up until the crash and that election in 2011.
Yeah, now, there's a portion of the country for which the economic war and the Blueshirt period, which are tied up, as I hope we've demonstrated, are a really difficult and traumatic time. They've seen their farms go under, they've seen the cattle slaughtered, and they've seen the police come around and seize their cattle in lieu of annuities. So, yes, some people benefit. A lot of people come out of it really hating De Valera as well. One of the things that I'd like to argue is, Civil War politics isn't just about the Civil War. I think the 1930s is just as important in the formation of Civil War politics, if not more, than the actual Civil War itself.
Yeah, and it must be very traumatising for pro-treatyites, people who believe this is our state. We have fought for the institutions of the state, to see the institutions of the state, the legal system, the Gardaí, turned against them.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Although I think by the end of the 1930s, they're a bit more reconciled to it. Like you have, for example, James Hogan, who is a professor of history in UCC. One time was a young man in the IRA of the War of Independence, in the Free State Army, the National Army, in the Civil War, and becomes professor of history and an ideologue of the Blueshirts, to be honest, in the 1930s. And he's arguing things about like corporatism. We've covered this before, but like, you know, he doesn't like Nazi Germany, but he's kind of ambivalent about Mussolini and stuff, you know, about how democracy may have had its day because people elect irresponsible leaders like this De Valera character. Now, the reason I bring this up is, well, a fascinating family. Brother Patrick Hogan was Minister for Agriculture, another brother, influential army guy. But the reason I'm bringing it up, though, is that James Hogan, who was writing quite extreme things in the early 1930s, by the late 30s, he's saying, well, Fianna Fáil actually aren't that bad. They're Irish nationalists. They're not communists. They're you know, they have a firm hand in security and stuff. They're not that bad, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you do get a certain amount of that. By the late 1930s, the passions have cooled a little bit from the kind of the white heat of the first half of the 30s.
Yeah, it's bizarre to think that, like, in the early days of Fine Gael, like, people are bringing up at meetings that we should be derailing trains and, like, you know, bringing arms and firing our weapons at these cattle sales.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, if we haven't covered it, the Blue Shirt period, and particularly like the agrarian protest phase, as John Regan called it, is terribly violent. You know, they're blocking the roads to seize the cattle. They're bringing down telegraph lines. You know, they're rowing with the IRA. It's not quite, you know, at the pitch of like shooting at the Gardaí and the army and stuff.
No.
But it's a level below that. It's quite a violent period. Because these people think, you know, that they have to resist possibly revolution or possibly just, you know, as they see it, a tyranny, someone who's wrecking their livelihoods.
So one of the things that should be said as well is that some of the critics of protectionism within Ireland were saying that Irish people now had the option to buy home-produced, manufactured goods, but some of these were of a shoddier quality than what they would have imported beforehand, but those imports now are much too expensive. And that it did produce a type of crony capitalism. That you had these native industrialists and manufacturers who, for all intents and purposes, were saying that, like, you know, we're the market, let us do our own thing, but they're getting grants, they're getting protected behind a tariff wall.
And this is true, though, and the problem is all you need to do is be connected with the political side. You don't need to be necessarily that good at business, because you'll be protected from competition. So, and this is true, and it does tell you, I think, a lot about the trajectory the Fianna Fáil party goes on as well.
Yes, in later years with the Taka brigade and the men in the mohair suits.
I mean, to translate that for people who are not familiar, you know, Fianna Fáil does go from a party which does have a radical edge to it in the 30s to being the party of their own establishment, an establishment of their own making. Certainly the post-war period, the 1950s and 60s, and the mohair suits refers to the suits fashionable at that time that the businessmen and all are wearing in and around Fianna Fáil. And TACA is a business organisation that's set up. It means support in Irish, but it's set up to support Fianna Fáil.
Where people can donate to the party.
But like, it's quite interesting if you look at the work of people like Brian Hanley and others of the Fianna Fáil of the 60s. The radical edge is entirely gone. Even though one or two of the same people are still hanging on, entirely gone. It's a conservative party by that time.
Yes, like it is the party of government. It has been the largest party in the state since 1932. If you were a careerist and you're going to look at the party of government, they are the party of government. Yeah,
and I mean, Fianna Fáil supporters would have argued, well, there's no contradiction here. We're this party of the Irish people. We advanced the Irish people, then we got them to we got them to a stage.
We're the real Labour Party, as the lads would say.
Yeah, and of course there was an element to that in the sense that Fianna Fáil was never a Thatcherite party in that sense. But like, we moved the Irish people into business, they would have said, and made them capitalists. And isn't that what we wanted? You know, and this is where Fianna Fáil went. So I mean, but the economic war is sort of like, you know, in Greek mythology you have the heroic period where the great battles are fought. And then later on it becomes, you know, much more mundane and uninteresting, maybe, to a historian. But the Fianna Fáil's heroic period, if you like, starts with 26, rising out of the Civil War. But they really fight their mostly metaphorical, but not only, battles in the 1930s.
Well, this is what I think is, when you're reading back about the economic war and the 1930s, it seems so alien to particularly anyone who's younger than me. Like, I can remember as a small child, like the 1980s and the early 90s, but in terms of being in the EU, particularly after Maastricht, particularly after 92, it's all about free trade. It's all about, like, single currency and no tariffs within Europe and anything like that. Even the idea of protected local industries is bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is one of the things, like one of the costs of joining the EEC in the 1970s did actually cost quite a lot of jobs. And it was the jobs created by these industries, created by the tariffs, the products of the economic nationalism of the 1930s. But I mean, I think we're going beyond our brief there, Cathal. I mean, the one other thing I'd like to say is, in terms of the economic nationalism and the protectionism, like we said, it's the norm in the 30s. Where it really hits a wall is the 1950s, where it can't go any further, where they have to look for an alternative, and they come up with foreign direct investment and much lower, tariffs for selected industries. And eventually, of course, with the EU and all, it morphs into a complete embrace of free trade, certainly within Europe.
Yeah, so one of the main architect of the economic nationalism, Sean Lemass, is also the man to bring it all down.
Sean Lemass, exactly, yeah. Now, I mean, to close out though, I mean, I'd just like to talk about, the implications for today, because for all that, historians are not supposed to think about modern implications, I think it's important. It's why we look at this in the end of the day. I mean, the first thing I'd take, Cathal, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, from the economic war is economic coercion does not work to produce political ends in other countries. That would be my first reflection.
Particularly when the larger partner in the dispute, who is prepared to use economic leverage to get a desirable result from their point of view, has so little understanding of the reality on the ground.
As so often, though.
Yeah. That they thought it's just a case of turning some screws and the Irish people will come back to their senses, and the belief that because the Free State economy was so dependent on Britain that any type of action from the British side would force them to collapse overnight.
Yeah.
And
it's just delusional. But you see this thinking today in various contexts, which I won't go into at great depth. But all we need is a few sanctions, a few tariffs, and they'll change their tune. No, it won't work, guys.
No, do we need any better examples than Iraq under Saddam Hussein, all these different places where we're looking now at Iran and Venezuela, is that if you put on enough sanctions, eventually the regime will collapse.
Now you're talking about, like, with some countries like Iran and Syria, for example, you're talking about much, much more extreme economic pressure than Ireland in the 1930s.
Oh, absolutely.
And in Syria may eventually have had a result. But in general, like, Iran would be Iran is still not comparable in terms of trying to ruin their economy, but it's still not going to work, though. It's still not working.
No, and it only emboldens and strengthens the governments that these are applied against in most cases.
Yeah, now the other thing, my other reflection, and this is just my personal opinion as well, is like, if you can view Ireland in the 1930s, which I think you can to a degree as a developing country, the idea that you do free trade and not try to develop your economy, I would say this is also a fallacy. And I would say this also has parallels with countries like even South Korea, for example, which is a very wealthy country today, but was only possible to create industries that we know, like, or businesses that we know, like Samsung and others, behind a tariff wall themselves, which in South Korea's case was put up by a military government in the 1960s. But I would say this is also a common thing, that actually free trade does not work for developing countries.
No, you're absolutely right. Like, if you're going to develop manufacturing, it's just too difficult to compete against long-established, cheaper imports of higher quality. It's just simply impossible.
Now, I guess what most countries do today, though, is they rather invite in, foreign companies to locate there. So it's a different strategy, perhaps, than building your own industries.
Yes.
But I'm saying the idea that free trade benefits everyone equally just is not true.
No. And, like, we should say as well that in the context of 1932, is that it's only 10 years since the country has been partitioned. And in terms of a national economy before partition, you had a strong industrial base in the northeast. You had a strong agricultural base in the rest of the country that was integrated into the UK economy as a whole. And it worked reasonably well. But, like, when you lop off and slice off the industrial base of the country, it's very hard to get up and running then again and become a successful economy in the 1920s and into the 1930s.
Yeah, I can't top that, Gal. I guess I'm going to have to leave it there.
Yeah, well, we've covered a lot there. It's an interesting topic, and there's some fantastic articles, as John was saying there, about the economic war, and well worth a read. So, you can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And if you get a chance, please rate and review the show on wherever you get your podcasts. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story, and if you would consider supporting it, we would really, really, really appreciate it, and there's a link in the show notes. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host John Doherty, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.